1. This happened when I was around 9 years old. I'm 34 now, and have been telling this story exactly as I will tell it now since the day it happened. The house I lived in at the time had a bit of a reputation for being haunted, or at least being a bit more eerie than usual. One day when the rest of my family were not at home, I decided to play up on my house's reputation and play a little trick on the other kids in my street. I got one of my friends to help out. The trick was I got my friend to hide in a closet in the kitchen in my house. From inside this closet there were 2 wires which, when touched together, made the house's doorbell ring. The idea was whenever I rang the doorbell twice, my friend would wait a few seconds and ring once in response. So that was it. I gathered together all of the kids playing in my street, about 7 to 8 kids or so, and told them that the ghost in my house was communicating, and that if I rang my doorbell then stood back, the ghost was ringing it again in response. So we do the trick 2 or 3 times and the other kids are freaked out. In the heat of the moment, I decide to embellish a little and say that if you ring the doorbell 3 times, then wait. The letterbox will rap by itself. In my head, I was already making up excuses for what I was going to say when it didn't happen. But I rang 3 times, stepped back, and sure enough, the letterbox goes in, holds for perhaps a second, but felt like longer, and then slams shut. At this point, I completely freak out and scream. Everyone else does too, and the crowds of kids at my door scatter in all directions. Ever since that moment, I have thought, if there's one thing in my life I would love to have explained to me when I die, it is that incident. Nobody was in the hallway when the letterbox rapped. Even if there was, the letterbox could not be moved from the inside. My friend was hiding in the room to the left in a closet. He would barely even be able to hear what was being said outside, if at all. It is the most mysterious thing I have ever witnessed. And I am a man of empirical science. But when I think of this incident, I can't help but lean toward some sort of telekinesis. Like all these kids who were already amazed at the doorbell ringing by itself, looking at that letterbox with the pure expectation that it was about to move, somehow made it move. Oh, that doesn't make sense to me. Nothing about it makes sense to me. Anyway, hope someone found this interesting. 2. Rewind a couple months ago when I finally closed on my house. The girlfriend and I have been remodeling when we can, she during the day since she works nights, and me in the evenings since I work days. I'm always the last to leave. The night stuff first started happening when I was sanding cabinets in the kitchen, and worked until about 10:30 to 11 that night. I cleaned up and finished up for the evening, and shut the house up and head to my parents', where I was staying until we got our house a little more livable. I backed out of our drive and turned onto the road to leave, and I noticed a light out of the corner of my eye. It was almost like I'd seen it turn on, but I played it off and just assumed I left it on. So I parked and went back inside to turn the light off. I got inside and saw it was our ceiling fan light, which is on a remote, and in the living room where I hadn't even stepped foot. I just shrugged it off and assumed it was something to do with my garage door opener. A couple of days later, same story. I'm sanding cabinet doors and frames right after work. My uncle lives a couple of blocks away, and wanted to know if I wanted to come drink a beer with him. I say yes and lock up, and turn off the lights and leave. I'm over there, and we are visiting, and I get a text from a friend, and asks me if I'm home. I say no, and they say that I left the front door open and the garage door and the lights on, so they just assumed I was working. I go over and sure as shit, everything is open and the lights are on. I shut everything up, I'm a little freaked out and I leave. My next door neighbor is a cop and I ask him about any weird stuff happening around the neighborhood. I specifically said it that way not to sound so immature, because being 27 and believing in the paranormal doesn't sound the most mature. Without hesitation, he starts in on how he believes his old neighbor, the house next door to mine, is still around. Kenneth, the old neighbor, passed away a year prior, Kenneth used to smoke all the time, and my cop neighbour claims he can smell cigarette smoke and see an orange glow on the street at night any time he gets up to check on his daughter. I kind of warm up to him telling me that, and it makes me glad that I wouldn't seem so crazy or immature. I then tell him about my door and lights. Well, ever since then, nothing has happened really until last night. We have since moved in, and I stay alone there most of the time since the girlfriend works nights and takes call a lot. Last night, after getting yard work done, decided to hop on Xbox and play some Siege with a buddy. I had a couple of beers and had my dog inside, who was happy as could be, chewing a rawhide next to me. About 9 last night, I start feeling uneasy. Nothing crazy, just something seems off. I play it off and continue playing with my buddy. About 10 o'clock, Moose, my dog, gets up and peeks around the corner of the hall. I can't see his head, but I can see his body, and notice his hair is starting to raise up his back. I play it off and ignore it. Moose has been staring into the dark in the hall for 5 minutes now. He all of a sudden freaks out and runs hard and fast to me like he has done been got. He jumps on the couch and hides behind me and starts growling deep, throaty growls. I start trying to comfort him, and he looks at me and whines, looks towards the hall and growls, and he is shaking so bad. He finally gets up the nerve to leave and goes right back to the hall and sits and stares kind of up towards the ceiling, cocking his head back and forth. He sits there and stares, cocking his head, for minutes again, and gets to all fours and starts backing up, staring forward the whole time still. His hair stands up on end and he starts barking and growling while trying to hold his ground, it looks. He finally gives up and runs to me and growls and barks. I try comforting again and give up and decide to take him around the house to show him everything is okay. We make a walk around the house. While he is trying to walk directly between my legs, I decide it's bedtime and we go out to potty. We go in and I put Moose in his little kennel. Can't trust him to roam the house free at night. I go to bed around 11 and lay there. I get that uneasy feeling again, but it's quiet. Moose is quiet, when he normally whines for half an hour before sleeping. Sometime between 11:20 and 11:30, I start dozing off. I get woken by Moose squalling like something is hurting him. I grab my pistol and run in, and he is staring at me, squalling, wanting out. I let him out, and he tries to crawl into my arms like something is after him. I take him to bed with me, and he laid on my chest all night, growling low, deep growls. Most of the stuff I told my girlfriend about, and she just laughs and makes fun of me for believing in ghosts. We are both Christians, and in our Bible it exists. I can't find anyone to tell this to without ridicule, and apologies for the sloppy grammar and sentences. It was a long night. 3. I just wanted to share a series of events that happened since I moved house quite a few years ago. When I was 12, we moved to a house not far from where I grew up. The house itself isn't particularly old, but the area has a vast history that includes hauntings, witch hunts, and a whole range of paranormal and dark stories. Despite never particularly experiencing too much in my house personally, friends and family of mine have mentioned things happening. I just wanted to share them and see if anyone had anything they wanted to share. There's quite a few, so I'll do them in the form of a list. Number 1. When I was around 14 years old, I was going through some grungy stage, and my bed was basically just the boards and a mattress on the floor. No legs or headboard or anything. One night I woke up to the feeling of my bed being shaken, as if someone was pushing it or jumping on it. As soon as I woke up it stopped, so I brushed it off as a dream, and didn't tell anyone about it. However, a few weeks later a friend of mine stayed in my bed while I was away. She was like a sister and would frequently crash at mine when I wasn't there. And the next day mentioned to me that she'd had the exact same thing happen to her. Number 2. I've had various friends tell me they've seen people standing around my house that have promptly vanished or looked out of place. They've been standing at the top of my stairs, behind people in reflections of mirrors or paintings, and looking through doorways as if eavesdropping on conversations. Number 3. My dad is a fierce skeptic, and has never believed in ghosts, but admits a few things he's experienced at the house. He once heard someone open our front door and run up the stairs while he was at home alone, and he and I have both stood in our kitchen and heard footsteps walking around my brother's bedroom above us when he hasn't been there. Number 4. Leading on from the previous post, one of my dad's friends is a medium, psychic, whatever the term is, and came round to do a reading, the idea of which thoroughly amused my dad. Afterwards, she told him about a man who wears a felt cap and a suit and stands in our kitchen, and a little girl who likes to run up and down the stairs. There's many more, but I feel like I've written way too much now. Feel free to comment opinions or other experiences. 4. So to start, you must know that I am a night owl and always have been. My mom used to call me her nocturnal child. Second, you have to understand the house I was living in at the time. Creaky carpeted stairs led up to a weird T. To the left was my room and a separate room. The separate room was next to mine but angled from the stairs, so I had a view of both the top of the stairway and the closer room from my bed. And to the right was my brother's room and a loft-style game room that we often hung out in. Straight ahead was the bathroom, between both our rooms. I was about 8 or 9 years old at the time, and I hated the house that we lived in. It scared me. I had no reason to feel this way, just the energy, especially my brother's room. I refused to be in there. Thankfully, as the oldest, I got first pick of the rooms. I immediately said, any room but that one. For about a year, I experienced many bizarre and unexplainable events that I kept to myself out of fear that my family would think I was nuts. These were weird things. I watched the attic ladder. If you've ever lived in a house with a pull-down style attic door, you'll know what I mean. Unfold by itself, and then refold itself, with no one around to do so. That can't happen without someone pulling it down or pushing it back up. It just can't. I had watched my window open and shut, hid under my sheets as my closet rattled violently, as if someone was locked in there. Had books fly off shelves and land at my feet several feet away. Had unknown entities sit on my bed with me, voices at night, etc. One particularly odd night things were quiet. As mentioned earlier, I was and always have been a night owl, so I knew everyone's bedtime routines and their normal sounds. My parents had a lock on their door, a sliding lock, usually so they could have, privacy at night. And my brother's door had an awful creak when opened, so I was fully aware that no one was roaming the house. I always slept with my door open, was always afraid something would lock me in. Probably around midnight or close to it, I don't know. I heard slow, heavy, methodical footsteps make their way up the stairs to the landing, but seemed to stop a few stairs shy of the top. Remember, I have a very clear view of the top of the stairs, but diagonally, so if you were 3 to 4 stairs from the top, I wouldn't see you yet. I waited for what seemed like an hour. I don't even think I blinked. Then, with me watching, I got to watch an apparition, I'll call it. A shadow in the shape of a tall man with a hat appeared in my doorway staring at me. I knew he was looking at me. I could see his eyes and his mouth, but that was the only part of his features that weren't distorted. He stared at me. I stared back. I don't know how long it was. He walked over, sat next to me, screamed my name, and evaporated. The screaming sounded so ugly and hateful and pained. My stepdad at the time ran upstairs to find me sitting there wide-eyed and confused, and repeatedly asked me if there was anyone in the house. Note, he didn't ask me if it was me, as the sound the apparition made was just so fucking fucking guttural that there was no possibility that it came from me. I went to live with my grandparents in a different city a few years later. My brother stayed behind with the rest of my family. I never told him or anyone in my family what happened that night, until more than a decade later my little brother and I were catching up. He was in town on break after finishing college exams, and we started talking about that old house. Not even a few sentences in, without me ever bringing up the subject of the paranormal, my brother starts telling me all these stories of a shadow man that plagued him at night. One that fit the exact description of my own experience. I cried. I started sobbing. My brother had no idea why. Reluctantly, after an hour of badgering me, he got the story out of me. Immediately he hugged me and we talked more about it and shared experiences. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or demons or whatever. All I know is what I saw and experienced over a few years. I've never had an experience since. I had actually thought I was crazy for a bit and tried to push the memories from my mind, though was never successful. That is until I realized that I wasn't the only one experiencing that horror house for what it was. Fuck that place. If anyone has any idea of what transpired, or even just what it was, would be greatly appreciated. I'll update more once I get a hold of my brother, and share my findings about it with him. He had more encounters than I. My mom found out I posted here, and added some background to the house. What follows are my mom's comments on the matter. Thanks for posting this story. I was more aware of events occurring than you knew. You did tell me about shadow people. I remember but didn't say much as not to alarm you, but I believed every word. The history of the house was the previous family had 3 teenagers. The oldest boy, your brother's room, had very deviant behaviors that welcomed and opened up, I believed to be doors to allow dark entities to linger. I fought against it as much as I could, but it as well freaked me out on many occasions. There were times upstairs the feeling was so tangible I couldn't explain it. I hated it. I hated the upstairs, which for a mother with 4 children living upstairs was terrifying. The one room in particular. I could never quite cleanse the house, but did my best. No amount of redecorating could mask it. Warning, do not move into a space if you feel anything at all in your gut that is off or a sinking feeling. The author of this post is not lying or embellishing, I know. I am the author's mom. Five. I recently decided to create a Reddit account to post some of the things that have been happening at the fire department I work at. I'm not going to say exactly where the fire department is located for privacy reasons, plus it isn't really important to the stories I'm about to tell you. However, it was one of the very old firehouses, the ones built after we stopped using bucket brigades. It has a lot of history to it, to say the least. Okay, on to the first story. I had been working there for probably about a week when this happened in the bay, where all the vehicles are. Attached to it is a room we use for storage. But we were in the process of moving all the stuff upstairs. We also kept the old apparatus in there, the one that you always see people moving in old photos. Before there were motorized vehicles, and before we used horses to pull it, it was seen as masculine or something to have the firefighters themselves pull it. Eventually, though, there were advances in technology that made the apparatus much, much heavier, and people could no longer pull it, and horses took our spot. Anyway, back to the story. When I had joined, I was told about optional classes I could take. I was on summer break, heading into high school, and needed something to get me off my ass, so I took the classes. Well, long story short, they were brutal, mentally and physically. So when I got back, I decided to crash at the station's bunk room. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by the door being slammed open, jolting me awake. I was exhausted, but full of adrenaline at the same time. I got up and went into the hallway to just see, barely, the silhouette of a large man crossing a corner heading downstairs. Keep in mind, there were other people sleeping in the bunk room, but that's only important later. The hallway was like 20 feet leading up to the corner, and I didn't hear running. I followed stupidly and saw the door leading to the downstairs closed, another red flag, because that door was extremely loud and creaky, and always made a lot of noise. There were no other doors that way, so I opened it and went downstairs. I was now getting chills, but needed to remind myself that I was a firefighter and couldn't be afraid of what could just be another firefighter. I got downstairs and decided enough was enough. I got downstairs and shouted, "Hey asshole, why did you slam my door?" I could hear my voice weaken as I said this, and I even had a voice crack. I got no response, and after checking the lobby went to the bay. I mustered enough courage to shout, "Whoever is there, please identify yourself." Still nothing. I looped the vehicles and looked under them, above them, and finally I went into the storage room. There wasn't a door, just those translucent plastic strips that hang from the ceiling. I shoved them out of the way and flicked on the light. After a sweep of the room, I noticed the old apparatus was gone. I also heard all of our SCBA meters beeping, which scared the hell out of me. The only reason they should do this is if there is air flowing through it into the mask. It does this so if a firefighter falls unconscious, other firefighters can find them and rescue them. In a panic, I ran back into the bay not knowing what to do. Then I pretty much shit myself when I heard all the bay doors open. I went to the switch left of me and saw nobody. I decided to run to the other side and check for anybody. Nothing. I ran upstairs to get help. I managed to wake up a very pissed off 6-foot former Marine who reluctantly followed me downstairs. On the way, I asked how the door slamming open didn't wake him up. He just looked at me weird and asked why I was shouting like a madman. I told him there was a possible intruder in the bay. If he wasn't awake before, he surely was now. He ran downstairs to the bay and looked around for anybody, shouting threats and all that. When I got into the bay, I noticed the bay doors were now closed, which meant that either the intruder was still in the building, or they escaped and closed the doors on their way out, while I courageously ran for an adult. I ran into the storage room and noticed one thing. The apparatus was back where it was. I thought for a moment that in my sleepy haze I had missed it. But those things are pretty big and hard to miss, so I don't think so. After realizing that nobody was in the building, the other guy yelled at me for pulling a prank on him. He then shut off the SCBA beeping. I know the bay doors were open when I ran upstairs, and there is no way somebody could have opened and closed the doors in the time it took me to get help. Also, SCBA equipment shouldn't malfunction like that, and if it does somehow, why did all of them do it at the same time? Finally, where did the apparatus go when I went down there the first time? I know it couldn't have been there. The storage room wasn't that big, and it was right there in the middle when I got back. I doubt this was some highly sophisticated prank. I wasn't superstitious before, but now I'm not so sure what to believe. Some of the older firefighters believe me, only because they have their own stories to tell. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Paranormal Stories, episode 65. I know it's been quite a while since I did one of these, and it felt very good to actually get one out. I'm not going to prattle on too much in the outros these days. I'll kind of preserve my voice as much as I can, so I just want to thank everybody for all your kindness, all your support. It did my heart good to see the reaction to the video I put up the other day, and I'm very grateful for everything everybody said. And with that, I'm going to head off for now, so until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.